This is one of those things I've kept to myself for years. It happened when I was around 25 or 26, long before I met my wife and long before we had kids. I was a completely different person then, not in a negative sense, just someone who had way more free time and a much higher tolerance for risk than I do now. Back then, I'd go on solo backpacking trips a few times a year, usually somewhere in the Appalachians. I'd drive out to a remote trailhead, hike deep into the backcountry, well past the main trail, and spend a few days completely off the grid. No signal, no people, nothing. I loved it. My friends thought I was nuts, and honestly, they weren't entirely wrong. One trip in particular was in the Cherokee National Forest, and it permanently changed what I think about backpacking. I'd been out there 2 days and everything had gone smoothly. The weather was great, the trail was quiet, and I hadn't seen another person since the morning of the first day. That changed pretty quickly. Late in the afternoon on day 2, I noticed dark clouds gathering out to the west. At first, I didn't think much of it. I'd hiked through plenty of rain before and it was never a big deal. But within about an hour, it became obvious this wasn't going to be a quick shower. The wind picked up hard and the temperature dropped fast enough that I actually stopped to throw on another layer. By the time the rain started, I was already looking for somewhere to wait it out. The problem was, I was in a pretty exposed stretch of trail, and like I suspected, it wasn't light rain. Within minutes, it went from windy to a full downpour. The wind was bending smaller trees sideways, and I could hear branches cracking and dropping somewhere up in the canopy above me. That's when I started getting genuinely concerned. Lightning was striking somewhere nearby, and I was hiking at elevation with a metal-framed pack on my back. Not exactly ideal. I kept pushing forward, completely soaked by then, scanning the woods on either side of the trail for anything that could pass for shelter. And somehow, almost like dumb luck, I spotted a structure through the trees off to my left. It was small, dark, and partially hidden by the forest, but there was no mistaking it was man-made. When I got closer, I realized it was a tiny one-story cabin. It looked extremely old, like some forgotten hunting cabin or a homesteader's shelter from decades ago. There was a single window on the side I approached. I can't even describe how relieved I felt. I practically ran to the place and pushed the door open. Inside it was dim but dry. There wasn't much to it, just a chair, a small table, and what looked like a cot frame pushed against the far wall. On the right side there was a stone fireplace filled with old ash and debris. The place smelled awful, honestly, but I didn't care. All I cared about was getting out of my soaked clothes and laying down somewhere. There wasn't a couch or anything, so I just picked a patch of floor and stretched out. At that point, I was in survival mode, not curiosity mode. The storm was brutal, and I was just glad to be under a roof. After about 10 or 15 minutes inside, I finally started looking around. The storm was still raging outside and there wasn't much else to do, so I pulled out my flashlight and started snooping around the cabin. That's when I realized there was more stuff in there than I'd first noticed. For one thing, there was a sleeping bag rolled up in the corner near the cot frame. It didn't look ancient like the rest of the place, which threw me off a bit. On the table, there were also a couple cans and some water jugs, which made me think someone might have been using the cabin as a base camp, maybe a hunter or another backpacker. Finding things like that in remote cabins isn't unheard of. But the longer I looked around, the more things started to bother me. There were marks on the wall near the door. At first, I assumed they were just damage from age or weather, but when I got closer, I realized they were scratches. A lot of them, some shallow, some deeper. There wasn't any clear pattern to them. I stepped back and looked at the door itself. The handle was just a simple latch, which wasn't unusual. Despite the storm outside, I opened the door to look at the frame. That's when I noticed the metal bracket mounted on the outside of the door frame. It looked like it had been designed for a padlock. The bracket was on the outside. There was no latch on the inside, which meant the door could only be locked from the outside. Things kept getting stranger. I shut the door and continued looking around the cabin. The only thing I hadn't really checked yet was the window, so I walked over to it. The glass was perfectly intact, which surprised me considering how old the place looked. Then I saw why. There were screws drilled into the window frame, one in each corner, holding it shut. And those screws had also been driven in from the outside. Around the edges of the frame on the inside there were more scratches. These ones were deeper and a lot more desperate looking. They looked exactly like someone had tried to pry the window open with their bare hands. Everything kinda clicked at once. Someone had been trapped in that cabin, not stuck there accidentally, kept there, locked inside. I probably should have left right then, but part of me assumed whatever had happened there must have been a long time ago. Everything in the cabin looked old. Even the sleeping bag, which looked newer than the rest of the place, was stiff and covered in dust. Plus, the last thing I wanted was to walk back out into that storm. So I stayed. I'm not sure how much time passed. Maybe an hour, maybe longer. The storm wasn't letting up at all. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. The rain pounding on the roof was so loud it drowned out almost everything else, which is probably why it took me a while to notice the other sound. It started as a scratching or scraping noise somewhere outside along the left wall of the cabin. At first I figured it was just a branch scraping against the siding, but then I realized I couldn't remember seeing any branches low enough to reach the cabin walls. While I was thinking about that, I heard 2 heavy thumps on the porch. They didn't sound like storm noise. This time I stood up. I did that thing where you freeze in place and stare at nothing while trying to focus on listening. If someone was moving around outside, the storm would have made it nearly impossible to hear them. That's when I started getting paranoid. What if those were just the only sounds I did hear, and everything else had been drowned out by the rain? My eyes drifted toward the window. I couldn't make myself look through it though. If someone really was out there, they'd probably be standing right there looking back in. So I just stayed still. After a while, I started convincing myself it was nothing. Probably just the storm. At worst, maybe some animal poking around the cabin. I was almost ready to dismiss the whole thing when I heard something that immediately snapped me back to full alert. Pressure on the door. Like someone leaning their full body weight against it from the outside. The wood creaked and the latch rattled once before the pressure suddenly stopped. My heart immediately started racing again. And that's when something occurred to me. Why would someone be outside in a storm like that, walking around the cabin, tapping on the walls, but never just coming inside? The door wasn't locked. Nothing was stopping them. Then it crossed my mind that maybe they wanted me to stay inside. Maybe that was the whole point. I don't know if that was the right conclusion, or if my brain was just spiraling, but I decided right then I was leaving. I didn't care about the storm anymore. I started stuffing my gear back into my backpack as fast as I could. I had this horrible feeling that something bad was about to happen, and unfortunately I was right. The next few seconds are still a blur in my memory. I was maybe 30 seconds away from walking out the door when I heard glass shatter behind me. I spun around just in time to see something come crashing through the window, and then the entire room erupted in flames. The fire spread so fast I couldn't even process what was happening. One moment I was standing in a dark cabin, and the next the walls were burning. The heat hit me like a physical wall. I ran for the door, but it wouldn't move. It had been jammed from the outside. I slammed into it as hard as I could. The door finally gave way, ripping off its hinges, and I fell out onto the porch with it. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I could barely see anything. I just ran blindly through the rain and woods, trying to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. But before I got far, something hit me from behind and knocked me to the ground. Someone was on top of me. Suddenly I was fighting for my life. I clawed, kicked, screamed, anything I could do. But the guy wouldn't get off me. He was yelling too, trying to get his arm around my neck in a chokehold. He was gouging at my eyes, pulling my hair. I started feeling lightheaded, but somehow I managed to shove him off. I scrambled to my feet and ran again. Behind me I could hear him screaming like a lunatic. I looked back twice. I never saw him clearly, but I did see the cabin. It was completely engulfed in flames. That image of the fire is burned into my memory forever. The second time I looked back, the glow was smaller, but still visible through the trees. I just kept running. For all I knew, he was right behind me. I didn't stop until my legs gave out. Eventually, I found a spot where 2 large fallen trees had leaned against each other, creating a narrow gap underneath that blocked most of the rain. I crawled under there and collapsed. At that point, I couldn't feel my body anymore. I don't know if it was the fire, the cold rain, the attack, or all of it combined. I just sat there crouched, trying to breathe. I have no idea how long I stayed under those trees. Time stopped meaning anything. Eventually, feelings started coming back into my hands and legs, and I realized I needed to move, or I might not make it through the night. Whoever had attacked me could still be out there. So I got up and started moving through the woods. I didn't know where the trail was. I didn't even really care. Somehow I survived that night, At some point I stumbled onto a random trail and just followed it. I was soaked, probably bleeding in a few places, but I kept going. Eventually the rain eased up enough that I could get my bearings. I ended up at a trailhead. The storm had mostly passed by then. After that, everything is kind of fuzzy. The first person I ran into drove me to a hospital. I had second-degree burns on my left forearm and the back of my neck. The doctors told me I was lucky I hadn't inhaled more smoke. Nothing was permanent, but it hurt like hell for a long time. By the time I healed up and was back home, I told myself I'd never go backpacking alone again. Someone intentionally set that cabin on fire to kill me. That's the only explanation that makes sense. It was pouring rain in the middle of a thunderstorm, and the cabin had a metal roof. There's no way a wooden structure ignites that fast unless something had been done to it beforehand. The thing that bothers me the most about it is the timing of it all. My wife would probably say I stopped doing solo trips because I got older and more responsible, and she wouldn't be completely wrong. But the truth is, I never told her about this. And I know for a fact I will never go backpacking alone again. This happened maybe 6 or 7 years ago. I was backpacking solo through a state forest. The whole trail system there was regulated. You had to book designated campsites ahead of time. The trail itself was long, something like 80 miles end to end, so I doubt rangers came through very often. The campsites were mostly about bear safety, keeping the area clean, and having some kind of record of who was out there and for how long. The hike to the first campsite was long but uneventful. I got there around midday and just rested the rest of the afternoon. The whole time, on the trail and at camp, I didn't see a single person. It was off-season, so it wasn't shocking, but it stood out. I turned in early and slept pretty well. The only thing I remember is waking up once in the middle of the night to what sounded like footsteps coming down the trail. I didn't think too hard about it at the time. I was half asleep and ended up knocking right back out. But I do remember thinking it was odd. Who hikes at 2 or 3 in the morning? Still, it didn't stick with me enough to matter. I got up early, made breakfast and coffee, packed up, and started toward the next campsite. The trail was just as empty as the day before. That second stretch was longer, about 4 miles more, and it went deeper into the forest with more elevation. By the time I made it to the next site, it was getting late. Not dark yet, but close. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and by then the sun was already dropping. I still hadn't seen a single person all day. At that point, it started to feel a little strange how empty it was. Not wrong exactly, just unusually quiet. I tried to enjoy it. A few hours passed. I wasn't hiking the next day, so I stayed up later than usual. I think it was around 9 or 10 when I heard footsteps again. This time coming from down the trail behind me, the direction I'd come from. When I turned, I saw a light too. Just a small headlamp weaving between the trees, getting closer. It immediately reminded me of the night before. It seemed crazy that someone would still be hiking that late, especially out there. And if it was the same person from the night before, then at some point we should have crossed paths during the day. But I hadn't seen anyone. I kept watching. The light got closer, and then suddenly stopped. It looked like it was pointed right at me. A couple seconds later, it shifted, then veered off the trail entirely, disappearing into the woods away from my campsite. About 20 seconds after that, the light just shut off. No footsteps, no movement, nothing. It felt deliberate. Like as soon as they got close enough to see me, or my fire, they didn't want to be seen anymore. If they had just walked past, I would have thought it was weird, sure, but not alarming. But stepping off the trail in the middle of the night and killing the light right when they came into view, that didn't sit right. I kept watching that direction for a long time, 15, maybe 20 minutes. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself they'd probably just set up camp somewhere off trail. Maybe they had a reservation further ahead and got delayed, so they stopped early. It didn't explain the night before, but there was no way to know if it was even the same person. Another hour went by. I don't know why I was still awake, tending the fire. I just didn't feel tired. It was like my body didn't want me to go to sleep yet, so I didn't. I'm honestly glad I stayed up. Because out of nowhere, I heard something behind me. A very soft crunch, like someone stepping on leaves but trying not to. It was close, way too close. I jumped up and turned, but couldn't see anything at first. Whatever made the noise had stopped immediately. I reached into my bag, grabbed my flashlight, and aimed it straight into the trees. That's when I saw him. Way closer than he should have been. Right away something felt wrong. He didn't look like a hiker, no gear, no pack, just normal clothes. And the strangest part? He didn't move when the light hit him. It was like he thought I couldn't see him. I shouted, "What the hell are you doing?" For a second it looked like he might run, but instead he started walking toward me. He was smiling, and as he got closer, something clicked. There was something familiar about him. I knew I'd seen him before somewhere, but I couldn't place it. Then he said my name. Like we knew each other, like we were friends. And that's what made everything drop out from under me. I knew I'd never spoken to this guy, never introduced myself. He'd been following me, not just that night, probably for days. Long enough to track me from wherever he first saw me, all the way out to the trail and into the forest. That's why he didn't look like a backpacker. He'd been staying far enough behind that I never noticed him, then moving around at night when he thought I'd be asleep. He kept smiling as he got closer. He said my name again, like he didn't understand why I looked scared. I started backing up. His expression dropped instantly. He asked what I was doing, but his voice had completely changed. No emotion at all. I didn't answer. I just threw my backpack on and started moving toward the trail. He said my name again, this time shouting it, and then I heard his footsteps pick up. I ran. I turned off my light and just bolted down the trail, hoping the darkness would give me some kind of advantage. I could hear him behind me for maybe 15 seconds, but it didn't sound like he fully committed to chasing me. It was like he followed just far enough, then stopped near the campsite. I didn't stop moving. I walked the entire night. At some point, I used my satellite emergency phone to contact authorities while I kept putting distance between me and that place. Eventually, I met a park ranger several miles away, not far from my first campsite. I got out safely after that. They never found him. No car at the trailhead, no reservations, nothing. And the thing that still bothers me is this. For him to get out of that forest without being seen, he would have had to hike off trail for miles, probably dozens, in the right direction. In terrain like that, with no real gear, that's incredibly difficult. Even experienced backpackers struggle with that. So the chances of someone like him making it out aren't great. But I still don't know who he was, just someone I'd seen somewhere before. If he did make it out, there's nothing stopping him from finding me again. Sometimes I wonder if those earlier times I remember seeing him weren't random at all. Maybe he'd been watching me longer than I realized, and if I'm being honest, there's a part of me that hopes he never made it out of that forest. This happened to me a few years ago. I was in between jobs and had way too much free time on my hands. I decided to rent a camper van and take a long trip instead of just blowing my savings on a short vacation. I've never really been a city person anyway. I like being out in nature, and this felt like a good way to ease into camping. I wasn't sure how I'd handle being completely alone in the middle of nowhere with just a tent. So having a van, something solid I could lock, something I could drive away in, felt like a safer way to start. So I picked up the van and headed north, toward a bunch of national forest land and public areas where you can camp for free. The first couple days weren't anything special. I mostly just drove and stayed overnight at truck stops so I could keep moving. I think I was trying too hard to make my first real campsite something amazing instead of just picking a normal campground and figuring things out. By the third day, I finally had a shot at camping out in the wilderness. I was on this long, empty stretch of road, nothing but public land in every direction. I was using an app to find campsites other people had marked, and I had a few saved in my GPS in case one didn't work out. The problem was, none of them existed. Every single time I reached one of the spots, there was nothing there. No trail, no clearing, no sign anyone had ever camped there, just trees. I must have spent over an hour driving down this rough, unpaved road, checking spot after spot and coming up empty. By then I was getting frustrated. I was already way out there, and it was starting to get late. It felt like I was racing the sun. Once it got dark, there was no way I'd be able to spot any of these barely visible trails. To make it worse, I didn't have service anymore, so I couldn't even look up new spots. The only option would have been driving an hour back just to maybe find something else. Eventually, I caught a glimpse of a narrow path branching off the road. I almost missed it. At that point, I was already about 30 minutes past all the locations I'd marked, and this was the first actual trail I'd seen. It looked even rougher than the road I was on, but the van could handle it, and since it connected to the same road all the other campsites were supposedly on, I figured it had to lead somewhere. I backed up and turned onto it. My headlights barely cut through the trees as I crawled down the path. It went on for maybe 5 minutes before it just ended. There was a single small clearing, barely big enough to fit the van. No other paths branching off. No signs of other campsites. Just that one spot. And for some reason, that bothered me more than anything else so far. I'd been hoping there'd be other people nearby, at least for my first time out like this. Being completely alone out there didn't feel great. I sat in the driver's seat for a while, just staring out into the woods. Something about the place felt off. I can't really explain it, but it was one of those gut feelings that tells you to leave. On any other day I probably would've, but I was tired, frustrated, and honestly kind of fed up with trying to find somewhere else. I told myself I was just overthinking it because it was my first time doing something like this. So I stayed. I shut off the van and moved into the back. It was already dark, so there wasn't much I could do outside anyway. I laid down for a minute to decompress from the drive. Then I heard footsteps, right outside the van. Before I could even sit up, there was a loud knock on the driver's side window. It startled the hell out of me. I'd only been there a few minutes, so I figured it had to be another camper. Maybe I just hadn't noticed where they were set up. I went up front and saw a man standing by the door, looking in at me. He gave this awkward, almost forced smile, the kind that's supposed to be friendly but doesn't quite land. I asked if everything was okay. He said yeah, introduced himself as Mike, and said he just wanted to come by and say hello to his neighbor before it got too late. At the time, I didn't really know if that was normal or not, but a few things immediately felt off. First, I had no idea where he came from. I hadn't seen any other campsites, and there was nowhere obvious nearby he could have been staying. Second, it was already fully dark out, not getting dark. And third, the guy was twitchy. He kept shifting his weight, his eyes constantly flicking past me into the van, like he was looking for someone else, like he expected another person to be standing behind me. That made me very aware of the fact that I was alone. I told him, thanks for stopping by, trying to stay polite but clearly ending the conversation. As I stepped back, I noticed he didn't move. He just stood there, watching me as I went toward the back of the van. I waited maybe 15 seconds, then pulled the curtain slightly and looked out. He was gone. Immediately, I started checking all the windows, trying to spot any kind of light, flashlight, lantern, anything that would show me where he went or where he was camped. Nothing. No movement, no light, no sound. The trees around the van were completely dark and still. That's when it really started to bother me. I thought about leaving again. Being out there alone was one thing. Being out there with that guy somewhere nearby was something else. But at the same time, I kept thinking, if I could just figure out where he was, I'd feel better. At least then, I'd know where to expect him from. I spent probably 20 minutes checking every angle around the van. Nothing. Eventually, I realized if I couldn't figure it out, I'd have to leave, and I really didn't want to go through that whole process again. So I made a bad decision. I decided to step outside and take a look. I went up front, opened the door, and stepped out. It was almost completely dark. The trail I came down was barely visible behind me. I stood there, slowly turning, trying to spot anything. That same feeling came back, that heavy, uneasy sense that something wasn't right. And right when I started thinking I should get back inside, I heard a small shuffle. Right behind me, I quickly moved around the side of the van and looked. Nothing. But I knew the sound came from right there. I hesitated for a second, then slowly crouched down and looked underneath the van. I saw his eyes, looking straight back at me. I didn't even think. I jumped up and ran back inside. As I scrambled in, I heard him call out, and the van shook as he crawled out from underneath. I barely got the door shut before he was there, slamming against it. He looked completely different up close, still twitching, but now there was something else in his face, something violent. His eyes were wide and unfocused like an animal. He started hitting the window as hard as he could. I turned the van on immediately. As I started driving, I could hear him grabbing at the sides, trying to hold on, still trying to get in. The trail out was rough, and all I could think was I couldn't afford to get stuck out there with him. A few times he managed to keep up, trying to get at the doors or windows while I was maneuvering over the terrain. But eventually, about halfway back, I got enough distance. Once I hit the main road, I didn't stop. I drove for 2 hours straight until I reached a small town. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there replaying everything. I'm convinced that if I had stayed, or if he'd gotten into the van, I wouldn't have made it out of that forest. The way he looked when I caught him under the van, the way he acted after. It didn't feel random. It felt like something that had already decided what it was going to do.